When I first got an airbrush, I thought it was going to be easy, and my models would look instantly pro-level stuff. You just pour in the paint, pull the trigger, and voila, perfection. How hard could it be, right? In reality, I got a lot of paint splatters, clogged airbrushes, and uneven results that made my kits look even worse than when I was trying to brush paint them. What I want to do today is pay it forward a little bit and help you avoid some expensive headaches. So here are some airbrushing tips I wish I had known when I started out. Probably the most important piece of knowledge, if I could drive home to you anything about airbrushing, it would be this: thin your paints. If your paint is splattering, you're getting clogged airbrushes, you probably aren't thinning your paint enough. Now, there's no magic number for thinning paint. I wish there were. That would make it a lot easier for all of us, but the fact of the matter is, it just doesn't exist. I do kind of say 50-50 is a starting point. There's no paint out there, in my mind, that you can start with anything less than a 50-50 ratio of thinner to paint. In reality, you're looking at a ratio of 60-40 or 70-30, and that's thinner to paint. So, there are sweet spots for different kinds of paint, and even certain colors. Some colors can be a little thicker than others. You'll just have to kind of play around with it and get a sense of it as you're starting out with this. The type of thinner you use for airbrushing is going to depend entirely on the type of paint that you're using. Now, there are 3 kinds of paint you're going to encounter as a modeler. There's the lacquer-based paint, like this AK Real Colors. There's the solvent-based acrylic, like the good old standard Tamiya stuff. And then there are the water-based acrylic paints, like this Ammo by Atom stuff here. Now, I don't use a lot of lacquer paints, and that's not, because of any good reason I can give you, other than I don't have the best ventilation where I paint, and lacquer is one of those things where you have to have good ventilation if you're going to spray lacquer paints. I use a lot of the Tamiya solvent-based stuff, and then this Ammo acrylic, water-based acrylic stuff. For the most part, I just use Mr. Leveling Thinner. I think it's the best all-around thinner. I even use it for cleaning your airbrush, something we'll get into later. But I use it for Tamiya paints. I use it for any solvent-based stuff. You can use it for lacquer paints, but you can't use it for water-based acrylic stuff. And there's a key reason why. It's just a little too heavy-duty solvent-based for that. And if you do try to use something like Mr. Leveling Thinner with a water-based acrylic paint, you're going to get clumpy paint that's going to screw up your paint job and maybe your airbrush too. And you don't want that. So now for the water-based acrylics, I would recommend using the brand-specific paint for it. So I just picked up this Atom thinner to go with these Ammo Atom paints. I would rather just, for me personally, I would rather just avoid the headache and go with the brand-specific stuff and mix it at that same 60-40, 70-30 ratio for this stuff. It's not just paint you need to thin either. I like to thin my varnishes and chipping fluid too. Again, 50-50 or higher ratio for that. That stuff's really thick and really gloopy, and it can get really sticky and gunky in your airbrush. In fact, of the 5 airbrushes I've ruined in my airbrushing career so far, 3 of those cases, it was with varnish. Now, there are some paints out there that say they don't need to be thinned. I'm dubious of that claim. I've tried it a couple times with 2 different paints, and while I didn't, one was actually really good quality, but not thinning it made a huge mess. So if you're working with a paint that says it doesn't need to be thinned, I would thin it out, or like I said, at least maybe use some paint retarder or some flow improver with it, and then test it out to kind of get a feel for what ratio you need for that paint specifically. All right, tip number 2 is a fairly obvious one, but it's not one I had a good grasp on when I started out with an airbrush, and it cost me. I'm almost embarrassed to admit it, but if you have a double action trigger, use the double action. That means press down to get the air out and then pull it back to let the paint out. And then when you're done spraying paint, with the trigger pressed down, let it go back up before you take your finger off there. So down, back, up, off. follow that simple steps. If you're painting with a double action airbrush, that's going to save you splattering paint. That's going to save you from getting tip dry, which helps make the airbrush clog or makes a mess when you're trying to paint your model. It's just going to save you a lot of time and trouble and redoing models or anything like that. Next tip might seem like a fairly obvious one, but I think there's a little bit of nuance to the pressure and distance that you need when you're painting with an airbrush. And I'm putting these two together because I think there really is two sides of the same coin, air pressure and the distance that you're painting at. There's no magic number for pressure. Every compressor is going to be a little different. And so you just really have to kind of test it out and get a feel for your equipment. Now, I rarely go above 20 PSI on my compressor for anything but cleaning my airbrush. The pressure you use on your airbrush also kind of depends on the distance at which you are airbrushing. So for something like primer, you're not going to be up super close if you were, say, painting details. So with primer, you can get that 18 to, at least in my compressor, I can get 18 to 20 PSI to spray coats of primer on there, or even a base coat, single colored base coat. Now, if you're coming back and doing post shading or highlighting or fine lines like German camo, say, or figure painting or anything like that, you've got to dial that pressure down. The closer you are to what it is you are painting, the less pressure you're going to want to use coming out of that airbrush. All right, tip number 3 is what I call the blowout, and whatever you want to call it. Basically is if you're pausing when spraying, or even if it's like the first instance of spraying paint on your surface, don't shoot it right onto the model or surface right away. Spray it out on a paper towel, your hand, your glove, whatever it is. Just give it a little shot, and that gets any kind of paint that's built up in the tip that could splatter on your model. That gets it out of the way. And it's just going to kind of save you some cleanup and hassle on later on down the line. You want to spray your paint in thin layers. The reality is, if you have thin layers, you'll use less paint. The same is true for thinning paint. You're going to use a lot less paint. Save some money and hassle of running out of paint. But when you spray it in thin layers, you're just going to get a better overall coverage by building it up. And I would recommend this even with primer, where you're looking for just one even layer across the model. If you spray it on in thin coats, you're just going to get better coverage overall. It's going to help you spot the areas where you missed, like say if you're painting a tank, like behind the wheels or inside the bogies or something like that. It gives you a little bit better control of what it is that you're painting. Painting in thin layers is especially important if you've done pre-shading with your model. Say that's where you've done the black and white zenithal type primer to kind of, show the highlights and things like that on it. If you cover that with a big thick layer of paint, all that work is going to be wasted. You're not going to be able to tell the difference from where there's white paint or black paint underneath it. But if you're applying it in thin layers, you can kind of see that as you go along and see that, it's giving you the effect that you want in terms of highlights and shadows. Now, the flip side of that's true as well. If you're doing post shading, so that means like the lighter coats of olive drab that go on top of the turret or the surface part of the tank, whatever. Thin layers like that give me better control. It give me a better way to build up that coat and get the results I want and not have to go back and spend all my time correcting screw ups. And this is not really a tip so much as it is a very stern reminder to do this every time you use your airbrush and every time you're changing colors out of your airbrush. Clean it. Clean your airbrush and clean it well. The shortcut you take to cleaning your airbrush may save you some time when you're wrapping up for the day and putting it away, but it's going to cost you time the next time you go and break out your airbrush to paint a model, because you're going to cause a clog, and that's going to require a lot more time and effort to clean stuff that's already dried out in your airbrush after a day or two. You don't have to be quite as thorough as you are like when you're finished for the day, but I probably go a little bit overboard with it, because all the dried paint I can get out there is going to save me time and effort down the line. What I do is spray all the paint out, right? Get everything out of there, pull the trigger until it's done, and then pour in a little bit of the thinner, turn the pressure up, and blast it out of there. Next, come back with more thinner or airbrush cleaner, and then do that kind of back blow thing, which is where you put that stuff in there, pinch off the tip, and pull back on the trigger. And that's going to kind of create that bubbling stuff inside the cup of your airbrush. And you let that bubble in there for a little bit, and then stick it in your paint pot, spray it out, do it again and again and again. And when I bubble it up and let it go back, and I can kind of look in the cup at the thinner or cleaner that's in there, I can see that it's not cloudy or colored with paint residue. Now, if you're just changing colors, you can stop there and then put your new color in and start painting again. But if you're putting it up for the day, if you're done with your painting session, once you get to that point, what I do next is that's when I unscrew the nozzle and take the needle out. It depends on the airbrush you have, whether or not this is possible, but I've found it to be, this is another late lesson I learned, I found it to be a little easier to push the needle out from the back and pull it out through the front so that I'm not pulling paint into the trigger area or other parts of the airbrush where I don't want it and where it's even going to be harder to clean out. Pop your needle out, dip it in your cleaner, wipe it off on a paper towel, kind of see what residue's left on there. If it wipes off on the paper towel and there's no paint, you're pretty much done at that point. And then stick it back in your airbrush, push it through again, and do that until there's no paint residue left in there. Another thing I like to do is I like to take the nozzle off and just clean it up a little bit. Wipe it down with a paper towel with a little bit of wetted with a little bit of thinner, or a Q-tip or something like that. Just wipe that thing off, wipe the seal, wipe the nozzle, the back end of the nozzle. One more step, and you don't necessarily have to do this last. You could do this earlier in the process too, after you've kind of blown it out with the blowback stuff. Take a Q-tip, dip in thinner or a cleaning solution, rub it around inside the cup to get all the residual paint out of there. You don't want to leave residual paint inside the cup, because what happens is it's eventually going to make its way into the nozzle, and you're going to have either dried globs of paint in there or screwed up color or whatever. But the most dangerous thing is going to be the dried up paint you don't want in your nozzle. One last tip I think is really, really important, but easy to overlook because we're so eager to start painting when we get these airbrushes. Practice. Practice on cardboard, practice on the box, practice on a paper towel. Get a feel for the distance and air pressure you need. Get a feel for the kind of layer of paint you're going to put down on your model before you actually start putting the paint down on your model. Practice with your airbrush before you ruin your model. All right, those are my 7 tips for anyone who's just starting out with an airbrush. If you have other tips or other recommendations, specific tips for products, anything like that, drop those in the comments. I would super appreciate it personally. I think the other viewers will certainly appreciate it as they try to learn more about how to airbrush. And yeah, my name's Ryan. You're watching Sprue Goo. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button. And yeah, check back for lots more modeling content.